Hello and welcome to another episode in my year-long series where I'm looking at the many things that I have on my arty bookshelf. Every week this year I am pulling off some of the many books that I have on my bookshelf and creating a piece of mixed media art inspired by them. Let me show you what I worked on this week. So this week I'm still really thinking about maps and memories and so many things going through my head. And this book really caught my eye. It's a book of artist-made maps. The first section is really about maps or charts and diagrams of the human body. And a lot of these really reminded me of some of the things that I saw last summer at the Osler Library for the History of Medicine. That's inspiring. The scroll that I need to get back to that I haven't worked on in a little while. But then most of the book is really about geographic maps and maps of places that we're more used to. And I have always really enjoyed maps and creating diagrams of floor plans of houses and treasure maps. From the time I was a child, I remember doing that. This book I really liked. It's got such a variety of different maps. The other thing that surfaced on my desk this week is this little scrap of paper for a course on making fabric maps. The instructor was somebody named Bettina Matzkuhn, and this is a piece of her art that's coincidentally at the library where I've been teaching the stitching and embroidery workshops. And then that made me think of this book. Mayreau is a tiny little island in the Caribbean. It's part of the country known as St Vincent and the Grenadines. And it is really tiny. I think there are fewer than 500 people living on the island. The book was by a Canadian from Nova Scotia, and she's collected the stories of many of the residents and the people who live there. And it's a really insightful and eye-opening book to read about the history of the people who now live in the Caribbean, who are the descendants of people who were brought there as slaves and were essentially abandoned there when slavery was outlawed by their colonial overlords at the time. This is my sketchbook that I kept on my trip to the Caribbean. I love my travel sketchbooks. They're really the best souvenirs that I could possibly have. I draw the pictures on site live wherever I am. And that's our ship from one of the other little islands in the Grenadines there. And this is the ever-changing view from my porthole window. This particular pair there is a view of Mayreau from the ship. And I think further along there are more pictures of Mayreau. This fellow here, his wife told me that he was the model for the cartoon character Dennis the Menace. I believed her because I believe people when they tell me things, but I looked it up and I do not think it's true. Anyway, this is my Mayreau page. So there's a window in the church at the top of the hill, the view from the Combination Cafe in the one little village there, and some of the artwork on the walls, and there's the view from the beach, of the dock there. This view here is also from Mayreau as well. The next day, after we visited Mayreau, we went to another island called Bequia, and that island is slightly bigger. It's got a few thousand people on it, and it also happens to have a bookstore, which is where I bought the book of Mayreau memories. And there are my souvenirs from the trip, including a drawing of the book, the Mayreau Memories book. And one more map to look at, another map off the Caribbean there. And there, if you look down there, that's where you see Cuba, Puerto Rico, Jamaica, and then some of the other smaller islands there. So those are my inspirations for my piece today. And I'm going to use the textile map, the format of that map, as my inspiration. And I grabbed a piece of blue paper, light blue paper here, but I think it needs to be jazzed up a bit more if it's going to resemble the insanely beautifully turquoise blue water in the Caribbean. And if you haven't been there, that was my first trip to that part of the world. The water is everything that you've heard about it. It is just the most insanely beautiful colors. Even these two pieces of paper, they do not do that water justice, but This is not meant to be an actual copy of anything. I'm using just as an inspiration for a piece of mixed media artwork. So I thought I was going to use that crumpled up piece of brown paper for the islands, but I've decided instead to use these other pieces from that scrap of paper that I'd held on to for such a long time because I don't feel like I need to keep it anymore. So I told you about Bettina and her class. I didn't end up taking that class, but I had thought about it. It must have been right after I got back from my trip to the Caribbean, because I remember thinking that Mayreau would be my inspiration for the piece that I was going to make in the class. So it seems fitting to put this into my journal today. So the people of Mayreau, as I've already mentioned, are the descendants of slaves that were brought to the Caribbean to work on the plantations that were owned by the colonists that had come there and after they had killed off or driven away all the local populations. They brought in slaves from outside who were not familiar with the environment and didn't have any connections to work on their plantations. And at some point, slavery was outlawed. The slaves at the time were just abandoned where they were. They were just left there. Mayreau is a really small island, and it does not have a reliable year-round water source. It's also quite a way away from any other islands, so if you don't have a speedboat or a sailing boat, it's not exactly easy to get somewhere that has a reliable water source. Well, reading that book was very, very eye-opening to me. I mean, I knew a little bit about the history of the Caribbean, but not to the extent that the people talk about in this book. And then I decided that I would add a compass that you often see on maps. And I thought I would use the picture that I drew off the window in the church on Mayreau. And actually, I don't remember if I realized this when I was drawing it, but it is a compass. Now that I'm using it as my inspiration, it makes a lot of sense, but I was just drawing it because it was there at the time. The other thing is that until sometime in the 1980s, so within my adult lifetime, the people who lived on Mayreau were not allowed to build permanent homes because they did not own the land that they were living on. So what did that mean? So they lived in cobbled together shacks that were made up of pieces of wood, corrugated metal, cardboard, whatever they could find. And whenever there was a bad storm, their homes would blow down and they would have to rebuild them. Then sometime in the 1980s, the priest on the island worked with the residents to find a way for them to be able to purchase their properties so that they could in fact build some permanent homes. The other thing, as I've mentioned, there is not a year-round water supply. The priests from the church also helped them to organize to install some cisterns so they would have a way to collect water that could be used in the village. Yeah, really an eye-opening book to read. There was another interesting thing that came up in relation to Mayreau. So my daughter, when she was in high school one day, she came home and said to me, "Mom, my art teacher's going to Mayreau over spring break." And I said, "To Mayreau? Really?" Because I don't think I even know of anybody that's heard of Mayreau other than myself and the other people that were on the ship with me. And yes, it turned out that she was going to Mayreau. So I lent her the book. It's not like I was buddies with all my daughter's high school teachers. She was actually the only one that I got to know at all. And she told me about another thing. She told me about an art group that she had done her master's thesis on called the Situationist International. So they were a very avant-garde sort of middle of the last century European art group who would do things that were a little unusual and peculiar. And the thing that she specifically told me that they would do is that they would take a subway map off London and then go to Paris and try to find their way around the city. And I know that often when I tell people that, they look at me strangely and say, "Why would anybody do that? It doesn't make any sense." Well, that's exactly the point. Why would you do that? Well, if you always do what you're told, if you always follow the route that's already been planned for you, you'll always get where everybody else has gone. But if you try something different and unexpected, you may just discover something new. In some way, this all makes sense and all fits together. And so I'm going to try something that I don't do. I just don't do it. I do not sew on paper. I like to keep the sewing and the paper separate. Even though I am willing to paint on cloth, I'm not willing to sew on paper. So today I'm going to try something new, and I'm going to sew on paper, and I'm going to create a line that connects those islands, those solitary islands, to each other, because that is such a significant and important part of our life. Anyway, this is my piece for today. Lots for me to think about. Hopefully maybe a couple of new ideas for you, and I hope you enjoyed this video and this little peek into a few of the books that I have on my bookshelf. Here's the finished piece, and thanks for watching, and I hope to see you again soon. Bye for now.